Los Angeles, late 1960. A private room after a charity event. No cameras, no stage lights, no audience to impress. The people inside were used to applause. They decided who mattered, who lasted, who didn't. That night, someone turned Marilyn Monroe into a joke. Not loud, not cruel enough to object to. Just sharp enough to remind her where she stood. She smiled like she always did. Elvis Presley said nothing, and everyone in the room assumed his silence meant permission. They were wrong. Because what happened next wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't even meant to be public. But for those who witnessed it, the balance of that room never recovered. Some moments don't make headlines. They change people. And this was one of them. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The room was designed to look warm. Low lamps, polished wood, a piano no one planned to touch. But everyone inside understood the real purpose of gatherings like this. Not celebration, not rest after a long evening, but quiet evaluation. Careers were weighed here, reputations trimmed, weakness noticed and stored for later use. It was 1960. Marilyn Monroe was already late. That alone was enough to tighten the air. Someone near the drinks table checked his watch with a smile that wasn't about time. Another leaned closer to whisper, careful to sound amused, never cruel outright. In rooms like this, cruelty wore tailored suits. Marilyn entered without drama. No sunglasses, no apology. A simple dress, hair done too carefully for someone who didn't care. She paused just long enough to read the room, the way she always did. The smiles arrived on cue. So did the silence underneath them. She had survived worse than this. A public divorce from Arthur Miller, weeks of headlines questioning her stability, studios quietly deciding she was unreliable. The word followed her like perfume, light enough to deny, strong enough to linger. Tonight, she carried it without comment. Across the room, Elvis Presley watched. He hadn't planned on paying attention to anyone in particular. Since returning from the army, he'd learned to stay still, to listen more than he spoke. People treated him differently now, more careful, more distant. They respected him, yes. Some even feared him. But behind their eyes lived the same doubt, a Southern boy who sang well, moved well, but wasn't meant to belong in serious rooms. That was fine. Elvis had learned the value of not correcting people too quickly. Someone near the center, an older man, studio authority in his posture, lifted his glass slightly as Marilyn passed. "Well," he said lightly, not bothering to lower his voice. "Of course the star arrives once the spotlight's moved on." The laughter came exactly as intended, controlled, professional, the kind that didn't ask permission. Marilyn stopped. Just for a moment. She smiled, not wide, not false, but practiced. The smile of a woman who knew the rules and was tired of pretending they didn't hurt. Her hands curled slowly at her sides, fingers pressing into her palms as if anchoring herself to the floor. Most people didn't notice. Elvis did. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched the room recalibrate itself around that laugh, watched Marilyn straighten her shoulders and walk forward as if nothing had landed. He felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Recognition. This wasn't about jokes. It was about reminding someone where they stood. And for the first time that night, Elvis understood exactly what kind of room this was and what it demanded in return. The laughter didn't fade right away. It lingered, reshaping itself into conversation, sliding easily into the familiar rhythm of people who believed they were untouchable. Glasses clinked again. Someone refilled a drink that didn't need it. The room relaxed, not because tension was gone, but because it had found a target. The talk drifted, as it always did, toward work, schedules, budgets. Difficult shoots. The word difficult was passed around like a harmless technical term, stripped of intent. Marilyn stood near the edge of a small circle, listening more than participating. She nodded once or twice, offering nothing that could be misused. Then, someone said her name again, not sharply, casually, as if it had simply surfaced on its own. A younger executive, new confidence, old ambitions, tilted his head and smiled in her direction. "You know," he said, voice warm, almost admiring, "Marlilyn really is proof that charisma matters more than professionalism." The sentence landed softly. That was the trick. A pause followed. Half a second. Then laughter, louder this time, less careful. People leaned back, relieved by the permission it offered. A compliment, technically. Just sharp enough to cut without leaving a visible wound. Marlilyn didn't respond. Her expression stayed composed, but something behind her eyes closed, like a door gently shut to keep the cold out. She shifted her weight, steadying herself. This wasn't new. She knew the choreography. If she protested, she'd confirm their suspicions. If she joked along, she'd disappear into the caricature they preferred. Across the room, Elvis took a slow drink. He didn't blink, didn't look away. His gaze stayed fixed on the man who had spoken, measuring him with a calm that came from long restraint. In the army, Elvis had learned how power really worked. It wasn't volume, it wasn't speed, it was control and the confidence to wait. He understood the joke for what it was. He'd been the punchline often enough himself, the hips, the voice, the assumption that anything popular must be empty. That charm was a substitute for substance. The man laughed again, encouraged by the room's response. "But, of course," he added lightly, spreading his hands, "we love her just the way she is, don't we?" That was the invitation, the absolution, a way to enjoy the cruelty while pretending affection. Elvis set his glass down, not hard, not dramatically, just enough to free his hands. He had already decided what this moment required, not interruption, not outrage, something else entirely. And as the laughter settled into a satisfied hum, the room failed to notice that the balance had shifted, quietly, irreversibly, while Elvis Presley waited for the exact second to speak. Marlilyn rose from her chair so quietly that at first it seemed accidental, as if she were only adjusting her position. The movement was small, careful, but Elvis noticed immediately. People who lived under constant scrutiny learned to read exits the way others read faces. She didn't look at anyone as she stood. Her smile was still there, faint but intact, the kind that asked no questions and offered no explanations. It was the smile of someone who knew that leaving a room could be interpreted as weakness, but staying might cost more. A few heads turned. Conversation hesitated, then resumed in softer tones, as if the room itself were unsure whether this was a moment worth acknowledging. Someone near the wall cleared his throat. Another checked the doorway, already preparing a version of events where nothing important had happened. Elvis stood at the same time. The timing was not dramatic. It wasn't meant to be. He didn't raise his voice, didn't claim the space. He spoke as though continuing a thought that had already been in the air. "You know what's interesting," he said. That was all it took. The room stilled, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. Conversations dissolved mid-sentence. Even the piano seemed to retreat into the background. Elvis had learned that silence, when used properly, did more work than confrontation ever could. "In a room like this," he continued, voice steady, unhurried, "there are a lot of people afraid of looking weak." No one laughed. No one moved. "And only one person here," he said, letting the words settle, "strong enough to stay quiet." He did not look at Marlilyn. That choice mattered more than anything else he could have done. Instead, his eyes rested calmly on the man who had spoken earlier, the one who had framed cruelty as wit and called it affection. There was no accusation in Elvis's expression, no challenge, just recognition. The pause that followed was heavy, uncomfortably long. People shifted in their seats, suddenly aware of their own posture, their own faces. Someone opened their mouth, then closed it again. The rules of the room, so carefully maintained, had been exposed, and no one knew how to put them back without admitting they'd existed at all. Marlilyn remained standing, her hands relaxed, just slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The man at the center forced a thin smile, the kind meant to suggest amusement, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a point he couldn't quite challenge. Around him, the room exhaled in pieces. Elvis said nothing more. He didn't need to. The balance had already shifted. What had been casual now felt deliberate. What had been safe now felt observed. As Marlilyn took a step toward the door, the room understood something it hadn't before. Whatever came next, the night would not return to what it had been. And Elvis Presley, still standing in the same spot, knew this was only the beginning. The room adjusted itself with professional speed. Glasses were lifted again. Someone laughed too late at a comment already finished. Politeness returned, brittle but functional, like a repaired crack no one wanted to inspect closely. If anyone acknowledged what Elvis had just done, it was only through avoidance. Marlilyn moved toward the edge of the room, not rushing, not lingering. She had reclaimed control in the only way that mattered, by refusing to explain herself. That alone unsettled people. Silence, when it wasn't theirs, made them nervous. Elvis didn't follow her. That, too, was deliberate. Instead, he turned in the opposite direction and walked toward the piano that sat against the far wall. It had been polished for appearance, not use. A prop. Most people hadn't even noticed it since arriving. Conversations dipped as he passed, not out of reverence, but curiosity. Elvis Presley walking toward a piano always suggested performance. This was not that. He sat without ceremony, adjusted the bench once, and rested his hands on the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he began to play. The sound was low, restrained. No melody anyone could name. A slow progression, closer to a hymn than a song, shaped by muscle memory rather than intent. It wasn't meant to impress. It didn't invite applause. It simply existed, steady, unguarded. The room quieted on its own. People turned fully now, drawn not by celebrity, but by honesty. The music carried weight because it wasn't asking for anything. Even those who didn't like Elvis felt it. This wasn't performance. It was grounding. He played for less than a minute. Then he stopped. No flourish, no explanation. Elvis stood and looked toward Marlilyn for the first time that night. His voice, when he spoke, remained calm, almost conversational. "Marlilyn," he said, not loudly, not gently either, just clearly. "You once said the stage was the only place you didn't have to apologize for being yourself." The words landed without decoration. He didn't offer a hand, didn't invite her forward. He gave her something else, space. For several seconds, she didn't move. The pause stretched, thin and exposed. This time, the room held its breath not out of discomfort, but respect. No one dared interrupt it. Marlilyn finally turned. Her expression had changed, not softened, not hardened, but steadied. She met Elvis' eyes briefly, then stepped toward the piano. Not because she was asked to, because she chose to. Nothing romantic passed between them, no rescue, no spectacle, only a quiet transfer of dignity, witnessed by a room that suddenly understood it had misjudged the cost of its own words. And without meaning to, Elvis Presley had made the moment public, simply by refusing to make it about himself. The industry moved faster than truth ever could. By the next morning, the room no longer existed as it had been. It had been dismantled, repackaged, and redistributed through headlines, phone calls, and lunches where decisions were made between bites of toast. What had actually happened mattered far less than what could be sold. Elvis and Marlilyn, something more? Monroe finds a new protector. A quiet moment turns personal. None of it was accurate. All of it was believable. Marlilyn read the first headline alone, still in bed, the paper folded too carefully in her hands. She didn't finish the article. She didn't need to. The framing was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Every gesture reinterpreted as dependency, every moment of dignity translated into need. What surprised her was not the distortion, it was how deeply it cut. The words from that room had stung, yes, but this felt different. This suggested that even when someone treated her as an equal, the world would insist on rewriting her as a problem being managed, as if strength, when it appeared near her, could never belong to her. Across town, Elvis saw the headlines too. He read them once, then again, slowly. He felt the temptation rise, the urge to correct the story, to explain the music, the pause, the intention. One interview could have shifted the narrative. One sentence might have restored meaning. He refused, not out of stubbornness, out of principle. He understood something most people didn't. Explanations fed the wrong appetite. The moment he tried to clarify, the story would become about him, about motives, about rumors, and Marlilyn would disappear again. Someone else didn't stay quiet. The man who had made the joke, the one whose laughter had shaped the room, began sharing his version. Carefully, casually. He framed himself as misunderstood, painted Elvis as overly sensitive, Marlilyn as fragile. He never sounded cruel. He didn't have to. He knew how to sound reasonable. Marlilyn heard this secondhand. It arrived through voices she trusted less and less. Each retelling stripped the night further of its truth. Then the phone rang. It was Elvis. The conversation was brief. No apologies, no explanations, no references to headlines. They didn't discuss the piano or the room or what anyone else thought it meant. At the end, Marlilyn said only this: "You were the only one that night who didn't act like I was the problem." She didn't wait for a response. When the line went dead, Elvis sat still for a long time. He understood now. The cost of what he'd done wasn't public criticism, it was misunderstanding. And for the first time, even he wondered quietly whether silence had been enough. Time did what it always did. It separated people without asking permission. By 1961, their lives moved along different lines on the same map. Elvis was tightening his grip on his career, quietly, deliberately. Fewer voices in the room, fewer compromises disguised as advice. He had learned that control didn't come from confrontation, but from choice. Who you answered to, and who you didn't. Marlilyn's path bent the other way. Studios hesitated. Meetings ended without decisions. Scripts arrived late, already heavy with doubt. She felt the ground thinning beneath her, not all at once, but in small absences that added up. Invitations stopped. Confidence from others became conditional. She carried herself with the same grace, but the structure around her no longer held. Elvis watched from a distance. He never called her to say he was doing anything. He never hinted. That mattered to him. Help, if it was real, didn't announce itself. Instead, he made calls that weren't recorded anywhere official. Names were mentioned, others were avoided. He let it be known, without speeches, without threats, that certain people no longer fit into his future. When asked why, he kept it simple. Creative differences. A phrase broad enough to hide intention, sharp enough to end conversations. One project in particular crossed his desk. Big budget, strong backing. The same man from that room held influence over it. Elvis read the proposal carefully, then closed the folder. He declined. No explanation beyond the formal one, no public statement. Those close to him noticed the pattern, but no one challenged it. Influence, when used quietly, didn't invite debate. Marlilyn never heard this directly. What reached her instead was a sentence passed along through mutual acquaintances, stripped of names and context. After that night, some doors closed for certain people. She didn't know which doors. She didn't ask. It was enough to know the air around her had shifted, however slightly. Enough to know that not everyone had moved on as easily as they pretended. Late one evening, Elvis sat alone, watching an old interview of Marilyn on television. The sound played for less than a minute before he muted it. Her expressions filled the room, careful, thoughtful, alert. He studied them longer than he meant to. "They never listened," he said quietly, "to no one." He turned the television off. What he'd chosen had consequences. He understood that now. But some choices weren't meant to be seen. They were meant to last, and somewhere beneath the silence, something unfinished waited for both of them. The news moved faster than anyone could prepare for it. August 1962. Morning hadn't fully settled when phones began ringing across Los Angeles. Some calls carried urgency, others carried opportunity. By noon, the story already had a shape. Too neat, too rehearsed for something so sudden. Elvis didn't hear it from the radio. The call came from a familiar voice, one he hadn't spoken to in months, a man who had been in that room, a man who understood how information was currency. "She's gone," the voice said. Nothing more. No pause for reaction, no explanation. Elvis didn't answer right away. He stood still, receiver pressed to his ear, listening not to the man, but to what wasn't being said, the absence of surprise, the lack of care. Finally, he asked one question, not how, not when. "Who's already talking?" There was a brief hesitation on the line. Then, a list began to form. Names Elvis recognized immediately. People who had laughed, people who had watched, people who had done nothing and now had everything to say. He ended the call without comment. By the afternoon, the performance was underway. Statements drafted, stories polished, grief delivered in measured doses, suitable for print. Suddenly, everyone remembered her kindness, her brilliance, her fragility, always framed as inevitability, never responsibility. Elvis watched it unfold from a distance he refused to close. Requests came in quickly, interviews, appearances, invitations to stand beside others and share a version of sadness that required nothing real. He declined them all. Each refusal was quiet, final. He understood the rules well enough to know what he was breaking. That evening, alone, he put a record on the turntable. Not one of his. The needle dropped. Music filled the room, warm, familiar, unbearable. Halfway through the song, he reached over and lifted the arm, cutting it short. Silence followed, heavy, necessary. What unsettled him wasn't death itself. It was recognition. The sudden clarity of how quickly absence created value. How easily silence became regret once it could no longer respond. That night, Elvis didn't speak her name. He didn't need to. The world was already using it, for all the wrong reasons. The weeks after blurred into something quieter, heavier. Life resumed its shape on the surface. Schedules returned, contracts moved forward, people adjusted their tone, their stories, their memories. The machinery never stopped. It only recalibrated. Elvis noticed everything. Details reached him without invitation. Who had been there at the end? Who had left early? Who hadn't answered the phone afterward? Who suddenly spoke with authority about her fears, her loneliness, her needs? The same voices that once reduced her to a joke now handled her memory with theatrical care. Hassa listened. He didn't comment. At night, fragments of that room came back to him. Not as guilt, but as clarity. The way Marilyn had stood before leaving, the tension in her hands, the discipline it took to stay composed while being diminished politely. He recognized it now as something he had seen in mirrors before fame hardened him against it. He understood something else, too. He hadn't misread that night. He had seen the warning signs, not of what would happen, but of what already was, a system that rewarded silence until it became permanent. A room where strength was tolerated only when it entertained. This wasn't regret in the simple sense. Elvis had no illusions about control. He knew better than to believe one moment could redirect another person's fate. What settled inside him was different, an acceptance without excuses. "I did what I could then," he said once, quietly, to someone he trusted. No more, no less. After that, people noticed a change. Elvis became less patient with clever remarks, less indulgent toward humor that leaned downward. Conversations ended faster, jokes died unfinished. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't explain himself. He simply withdrew his attention, and with it, the permission people assumed they had. He listened more carefully now, not for words, but for what people avoided saying. He gave space where others crowded, silence where others rushed to fill it. One evening, someone close to him asked why he seemed different. Elvis considered the question for a long moment before answering. "The worst thing," he said slowly, "is being heard only after you're gone." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The room understood enough. Years passed without announcing themselves. Time softened the sharp edges of memory, but it did not erase them. Elvis learned that some moments didn't fade. They settled. They became part of the way you listened, the way you paused before speaking, the way you read a room long before opening your mouth. The question came unexpectedly. A young journalist, careful and respectful, asked it during a quiet interview that wasn't meant to make headlines. No cameras crowding in, no handlers hovering too close, just a recorder on the table and a notebook open to a blank page. "Out of all the famous people you've known," the journalist said, almost hesitating, "who left the deepest impression on you?" It was an easy question. Everyone expected an easy answer. Elvis didn't respond right away. He leaned back slightly, eyes unfocused, not searching for a name, but for the right amount of truth. The silence stretched. Not awkward, but deliberate. The kind that made people wait rather than interrupt. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even. "The one no one listened to," he said. The journalist looked up, surprised. "Who was that?" Elvis shook his head, once. Not dismissively. Protectively. "No name," he replied. The recorder kept running. The room stayed quiet. What he didn't say carried more weight than any story he could have told. He didn't speak of that night. He didn't explain the piano, the laughter, the pause that changed everything. He didn't correct history or claim virtue. He let the moment stand on its own. Because some truths lost their meaning once they were explained. Much later, long after the interview was forgotten, the image returned. The first room, the polished wood, the controlled laughter, a woman standing still while others decided what she was allowed to be, and a man who understood, perhaps too late, that dignity sometimes arrived only when someone refused to let silence become humiliation. History, people like to believe, was made by loud voices, but sometimes it was shaped by something else entirely, by the person who noticed, by the one who waited, by the one who chose not to look away. And that was why the moment mattered, not because it was seen, but because it was remembered.